So we know that back in the day, you could survive on one income for a family of four, but now that is no longer acceptable. So this video from CNBC is actually showing us why one income no longer pays for the American dream that once was.
Even high earners in the US feel the pressure to have two incomes. More than 60% of six figure earners say one income feels nearly impossible to live on. 26% of US households report their basic needs take up more than 90% of their income. And it takes two working parents to afford a middle class lifestyle. Households where the husband is the single breadwinner have been steadily declining since 1986. In 2024, nearly half of households had both spouses working outside of the home, and that number rose to 2/3 among families with children.
In my opinion, there there shouldn't be one person being claimed as the breadwinner. I think both people should be making their money equally, but that's just
Today's
me.
financial conversations often focus on the cost of housing, childcare, or education, but history shows this shift to a dual income as the norm isn't simply due to rising prices.
If you have the largest employing sectors in the economy not offering reliable, dependable, high wage, consistent employment, then no family is going to be able to make it on one and probably even two incomes.
For the last 50 years, we've seen this decoupling between wages and productivity, and workers have not seen those returns.
In the 1980s, temp jobs started to move into every sector of the economy. Firms began to outsource jobs to staffing companies.
But not everyone agrees the story is that straightforward.
Any story about people having to send a second worker into the workforce to stay afloat, that's too pessimistic a story to tell, because that would be more plausible to me if men's pay, for instance, had stagnated or declined.
It shouldn't matter, in my opinion, about men's pay being lower than women's. Women's pay can be higher, or like I should say just as high, if not higher, than men's. It shouldn't matter about men's pay, it should be about everyone's pay.
So why do Americans struggle to support a family on a single income?
Don't take that out of context, by the way.
From the 1950s to the 1970s, a single income could support a middle-class lifestyle, but only for certain workers.
The Fair Labor Standards Act was written in 1938, where the model form of employment was working in a factory for a manufacturing company that employed 50,000 workers on a long-term basis. So much of our work experience in the US doesn't look like that anymore. There was a time when the working class and the middle class always supplemented the earnings of one worker. However, what was different about American employment from the 1940s through the 1970s is that the job became more standard. You worked a 40-hour work week. You had a weekend. You had paid vacations. And I think we have to look at what made that possible, because it comes from two forms of leverage. One, that came from workers having more power through unions, but it also worked in combination with social and economic policy.
I mean, technically,
These
still have
protections
unions.
lifted the bottom of the labor market, but they weren't applied universally. Many women and workers of color were excluded from those protections.
With the 1960s, women and African Americans were certainly working before. They were in the labor market, but they were in the marginal labor markets, the ones with the insecure employment. What really opens up in the 60s with the growth of these kinds of jobs and with the elimination of racial and gender barriers to employment is women could really move into the full-time jobs that made employment worth it. The problem is that over the last 3 decades, those kinds of jobs have been disappearing. Those have been entirely restructured, and they've been restructured around the model of temp employment.
But also, haven't there been plenty of employment opportunities for not just women, but men to put themselves in a better position to increase the amount of money they're making to support themselves?
work
in a way.
was typically reserved for seasonal or clerical work, but that began to change.
In the 1980s, temp jobs started to move into every sector of the economy. Firms began to outsource jobs to staffing companies. Large companies outsourced entire departments. We shifted from thinking about workers as assets who you really wanted to invest in for the long term to thinking about workers as liabilities to the bottom line. And here's why this is important and why it really increased people's insecurity so much is because to qualify for those social policy benefits like unemployment compensation and a Social Security pension and for the Fair Labor Standards Act coverage, you have to have the status of employee. And so the more these companies shifted to
Temps.
changing the classification of workers and not having them full-time employed, the less access they also had to the social policies that were meant to compensate precisely for these kinds of insecurities. So the American workforce gets like a double slam. They're hit by increasingly casualized employment.
Guys, they have the right of way, Jesus.
Of unions
Actually, no, they don't,
and collective
but they do.
bargaining, but they're also hit by the inability to access the policies that would compensate for that.
Temp, contract, and contingent work expanded rapidly from the 1990s through the mid-2010s. Even today, millions of Americans still work through temp agencies, contract
Really?
firms, or on-demand platforms.
Interesting.
App-based gig platforms built on that shift, turning millions of workers into independent contractors, who may have flexible hours but frequently lack stable pay, benefits, and core worker protections.
But are temp workers the same as contract workers? I wouldn't think they were, but I guess my understanding of it is different.
We have 26 million Americans who are working as independent contractors, various forms of temp.
That's what I'm understanding, that they're
or
claiming they're close to the
contracted
same. I
labor.
didn't think they
But
were.
others say this picture can be misleading, and that gig and contract work make up a much smaller portion of the workforce than headlines suggest.
If you look at objective measures of churn in the labor force, the extent to which people are moving in and out of jobs, those seem to be down actually rather than up despite the gig economy. So people are actually staying in their jobs longer than in the past. Part of that, I think, is that the
I know he's probably going to mention a point, but they have to, because now trying to make any other job work with where you're at and maybe your 401k or your benefits and anything, right, is going to be different if you move to a different job, and it may not be the same. If not, it could be worse than where you're currently at. So they have to keep their current job.
gig economy is smaller than a lot of people tend to think it is. It tends to draw people who are looking for the flexibility that non-40-hour a week provides, and so they're able to cobble together gigs with parenthood, with school, with other things that they're doing.
For workers without predictable hours or benefits, even a full-time schedule isn't necessarily enough to guarantee a stable income
True.
or to be able to support a household on a single paycheck.
It's very true.
Another factor in the need for two incomes is since the 1970s, wages have diverged from worker productivity.
Hourly wages have grown so slowly over much of the last 50 years. That hasn't happened the entirety of the 50 years, but there are large periods of time when we saw wages essentially grow only as fast as inflation.
I think the wage productivity gap is being overstated because it's comparing the typical worker whose productivity may have increased less over time than in the overall workforce. A lot of researchers, unfortunately, use cost of living adjustments that are known to be less accurate and to overstate the increase in the cost of living. When you use the most sophisticated cost of living adjustments that have been developed by economists inside the federal government and outside of the federal government over time, you do find pretty solid increases in the wages and earnings of both men and women over the long run.
For today's families, it's not just wages that are causing an issue. It's also the rising cost of everything required to participate in the economy.
Because the costs have been rising so
Everything
much for so
has
many
gone up
families.
since
We know the cost of
God only knows
childcare, the
how
cost
long.
of healthcare, the need to be able to earn more money just to keep up
Yeah, I feel this
necessitated
guy's
more
frustration
hours
too.
per family.
In the US, childcare costs are between 25 to more than 100% higher than annual rent payments.
Damn.
Health insurance premiums for family coverage have jumped more than 25% since 2020, slightly outpacing inflation. Workers' wages have increased by 28.6% in that same period. College tuition has increased 197.4% since 1960.
Which is kind of ridiculous that you kind of go to college for a degree, and then the degree that you get, they're not paying you for, because what they want, and everyone kind of says it. And there's a previous video I did long ago. They want 20 years of experience. They want you to have X amount of this, this, and this, but they need you to be young. They need you to be literally fresh out of college, but they want you to have 20 years of experience. No college graduate has 20 years of experience from that degree because they just haven't gotten it yet. And you want someone something doesn't add up with this thought process.
And an estimated 5 million unit housing shortfall has helped push rents and mortgage prices far beyond what a single earner can afford.
I think more broadly, there is some economic uncertainty out there. And even if you have a job, there is concern that you are going to lose it.
Some economists argue that Americans may be feeling worse off even as many long-term indicators look better on paper.
If you look at trends in, say, hourly wages or trends in annual earnings, what you find is some point between 2019 and today is when you see the high points for both wages and for earnings, both for men and for women. So I think it's hard to argue that workers are worse off than they were in the past, or that they're even just treading water, especially among women.
Winship says people often fixate on the categories where prices have exploded, such as
Groceries.
housing, healthcare, childcare, and higher education,
Oh,
even though
wow.
many
Okay.
goods and services have become cheaper over time relative to income.
There's a lot of real anxiety that's reflected in reality. Prices are a lot higher than they were a few years ago. That said, when you look over longer periods of time and you think about how much prices have increased over 40 years, 50 years, what tends to happen is people focus on a few categories that have seen really big price increases. There are also a number of categories that have gotten a lot
Tariffs
cheaper over time, or at least
have gotten
cheaper relative
expensive.
to the increase in income.
The rise of tariffs has caused a problem. I'm not trying to get political with it, but with tariffs going up, that means the price of groceries goes up, which means that your income, also playing a part into this, will not support how much you can buy. Because before you could fill your whole shopping cart and pay $50 for everything that you got in there. Now you fill your shopping cart and you're paying almost $200, $300, and you're like, what the frick? You take half of that out, and you're like, it's still $200. What is going on?
Winship also argues the shift to dual earner households isn't simply economic pressure. It reflects more opportunities for women and different expectations of what a middle-class lifestyle entails today.
Any story about people having to send a second worker into the workforce to stay afloat, that's too pessimistic a story to tell. The increase in work among wives in particular, married women in particular, has been just as impressive among the wives of the best earning husbands, the wives of the best.
I feel like they're targeting people. And I haven't seen the like to dislike ratio on this. I kind of just started watching. I haven't seen this video before, but I don't want to go see the comments. I really don't. I just don't know what people are going to say about that. To me, it sounds like it's very targeted.
Best educated husbands, as it has been
If I'm wrong,
lower
let me
down
know,
the income
but
scale. So that suggests to me that this is really just broad societal change that we're seeing. Women have a lot more opportunities than they used to have, and so they're working longer and they're working for higher pay. And I think a lot more women actually want to work today and have careers. So somehow forcing more of them to stay home would, good luck with that.
there you go. See, and he's right. Good luck with that, because technically you can't you can't have one person stay home unless the other person who is working is making almost 6-7 figures in a modest home, right? Nothing overly expensive, but nothing too run down, right? Basic cars. You don't need anything too fancy if you can't afford it. Basic cars will do the job. like you don't need anything fancy, but everything has just gotten so much more expensive that you can't live off of one income. I mean, can we go back to where we were back in the day? No. Is it possible? Maybe. Can but it's this has just shown that you actually need everyone in the household working. If you have that, like if you have four people in the house, you need to have four people in the house working. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's just nearly impossible to afford anything in today's society. To live comfortably, it's, in my opinion, impossible.